let me.
Who's that? Mitch. Oh, and Eric Van Norman.
Let me do.
Did you meet Mitch?
Yeah, I'm working on it.
Okay, did I share the right window? Is this the API definition?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. Just curious, I can't see it. All right, so basically, I'm going to run through this fairly quickly because I think you know, at least a few of us have seen this before. The basic idea is that that there are two configurations that would collaborate to label requests through attributes, and this is all in the service of defining APIs in the system that are not tied to a specific service as the existing HTTP API spec is. This instead would be tied to the request itself and the authentication for that request. So who's sending it and what it is. So let me just kind of dive in here. The API definition itself is it's a fairly abstract, actually very abstract definition of a mechanism that allows requests to be labeled. In general, with HTTP, it's going to be some function of the host and the path, potentially some other information, but generally those two. And so what we see here is the CRD is just very open. It defines an API definition as some sort of descriptor, a kind. Well, yeah, I say descriptor is probably a bad word. Some kind of API definition. In this case, an open API definition. And then in the descriptor is configuration for that kind of evaluator.
So this using a different word than kind, because kind is used 5 lines above. So maybe type or class or something.
So, okay, if I can interject. So you're using API version config istio.io. I think we are trying to move away from that. So we should actually have a top level, I think, API version for the whole API management, I think, right?
Yeah. So, yeah, I haven't even noticed that.
Yeah. So, and that can actually help with the naming of your kinds as well. So instead of config.istio.io, we can have API management or something like that, API.istio.io maybe, or...
Yeah, that's reasonable. Or just API maybe? No, that's too generic.
No, so API.istio.io, I mean, like this is the naming convention. So there's networking, there's policy, there's other like authentication ones. So you can actually make it like an API.istio.io, and then you can now maybe change the kinds to match that. It's just that there's a usability concern there where if you use just definition, it may collide with other things.
Well, at that point, would you just put kind equals open API?
We can, but I think
no, I don't think so, because well, you could if you also changed the other piece of it. The other piece has to point to some sort of thing, and if all the kinds are various different kinds, then you would have to have two pieces of information: the kind it's pointing to and the ID of what it's pointing to, which maybe is okay, but.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Well, it's just that that kind field generally defines the schema of what comes below, and in this case, it defines just there's a type field, and then the type field defines the schema of the rest below.
So this gets referenced from other contexts, right? So this resource. So that's Scott's
right?
So
okay. It's not a big deal.
But I mean, you can pick a different name, like sort of kind. You can use type.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Okay. So minus.
Okay. Good. We've got good feedback already. All right. So, and there's just a note on support for large API specs that we should support crawling that information. But again, it's very very abstract. In here, I kind of break down how we might work with an open API spec. But as you can see, basically it breaks down into, a path and operation and that kind of thing. But that's specific to the type. gRPC as well.
So
Yes.
what's the, at this point, if I have an open API spec,
Yes.
how do I use it as a CRD? Do I just add
this? Yeah, you would literally paste it into the descriptor.
Okay. Okay.
So paths, operations, gRPC would work similar to how we currently use protos, and that you would just include the compiled proto in the descriptor.
That's fine.
So how do people fare with the current, like the mixer, like embed the row 13 thing?
I haven't heard any feedback either way. I don't think it's that big a deal. It's clearly not the best experience.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's not perfect.
Like, so the alternative here would be to unroll the descriptor in its proto, like JSON serialized proto form, right? Essentially, which can be very verbose, but maybe usable. Like,
I don't know. What I would find more usable if this were a file name somehow. So when you do kubectl, it would read this, read the file, and then inject it. But that doesn't exist. So
okay.
Well, so I mean that would be tooling, but that wouldn't change this, right?
Yeah, so like the way Martin is describing it, the end result will be the same. It's just that there's a simplification through the tool that allows you to just say, hey, here's a descriptor file, just upload it.
Exactly.
Okay,
so well, I think that's a good discussion to have. This is completely consistent with everything else we do at this point.
Yeah, but the same issue, issue arises for even the Open API spec. I would rather point to the Open API spec as a file and just consume it.
Right. I mean, the other way to go would be to potentially point to it as a URL and require retrieving it.
It may have problems though, right? So now you may actually run into firewall problems. So Galley needs to dial out to like open internet, which we don't require today. So
yep.
I don't know how is that different than say the operator that's going to download images.
But one of them has a very, like, as an administrator of a system, I know that you're going to dial to GCR.io, for example, right?
Yeah.
So it is very easy to whitelist that one versus an arbitrary URL on the internet.
Well, but no. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Yeah, so I guess we can make it just a wrapper. A dedicated utility or a wrapper tool of some sort.
I think we need to fall back to Istokal and just make it simplify these things.
Yeah.
So those are the only two examples I have here. I mean, one possibility also is if we like the idea of that kind of lower level HTTP API spec, that could also be supported. The existing one.
Yeah. I don't know. There doesn't seem to be much value for that by itself. I think it's fine as an operational format, but as for user input.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the value is that it's more just purely HTTP focused, right? It's not a larger spec. So
I suggest we wait until somebody asks for it.
okay, sounds good. Yeah, basically I just say there that operations in a gRPC spec would just be identified by, method name and, as a normal gRPC API would be. So that's it for the actual API spec. It's basically, it's kind of, in a way, it's a little bit of well, gRPC is well defined, but like OpenAPI and or other additional potential supported specs in and outside of HTTP, it's open to be able to, as long as you can label the request, label the operation of the request, you're good to go, right? So it's just a label, a labeling system. The other side of it is this, what we're calling API Gateway now, after many naming battles. The API Gateway basically, so if API can be kind of viewed as the client-facing view of a request, the API Gateway is the implementation-facing view. And so it provides more of the runtime information of how to actually process the request, which includes authentication, how the authentication maps to it, includes routing, and includes policy.
Okay, so some of the stuff in like the Cloud Endpoints product and other things, they've added extensions in the OpenAPI spec for auth.
Yeah.
In this case, it's not there; it's in here. That
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So that is a challenge. You can certainly add. The first iteration of this whole thing, we had talked about adding extensions to, for example, OpenAPI and potentially gRPC, right? The problem is the way we were going down that path is then if you wanted two different results, two different implementations of an API, you had to publish the API twice. And that was not at all intuitive to a lot of people, that the API should be the API and how it's treated should be handled separately. So that's basically the approach that we're taking at this point.
Yeah, and I totally like that. I think that's the right strategy. I thought mixing the implementation details in an API definition has just been correct.
Right. But I think, it's a good point to bring up, as we have considered that and been down that path.
So the only counter argument to that is, I think it creates a ramp up problem, right? So where it is simple, if I have an API definition, presumably I'm going to have a single implementation of that API definition. Just squiggling something into that definition, saying, oh, here's additional things so that I can make it run with Istio, is a easier ramp up path than saying, oh, here's a spec, now I need to reference things. This is like saying, I mean, this model is more aligned with how Kubernetes approaches things. Like, there's a ramp-up problem, but it's still powerful.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense from that standpoint. But
and to me, it's something that's kind of on the fence, right? If you need a particular kind of auth to call a method, well, it's really part of the contract of that method. But at the same time, you can provide multiple implementations of the same method that one requires auth, one doesn't. So what's the right split? So here we end up with strictly the shape of the API and the semantics of the API are in the OpenAPI spec, and the operational details are in here.
Right, which is literally, I mean, that is the intent of OpenAPI was never to be prescriptive as to how the API would be processed.
Yeah, it just means that as a customer of the API, you need to be exposed to some of this CRD as well in order to understand how to call this thing?
No, I mean, so there is a disconnect, right? Because you can put authentication information into an open API, right? As to what authentication is required. The difference. So what I'm proposing here is we aren't going to use that because in addition to the fact that it's very difficult actually to translate that into useful information once you get into Istio with its gateways and virtual services and things like that, but also it's not even something that you would necessarily want to allow from the standpoint of an operator for it to reconfigure your gateways and things. So so that becomes a big mess to try to go down that path. But it is there. It provides information to the users as to, well, you need to authenticate here with, for example, an API key or whatever. But by putting the actual implementation of how that is used in the back end, you perhaps duplicate a little bit, but it's not. I would argue it's not really duplication so much as elaboration.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyway, we can talk about that once we get there too. So the first part of the API gateway definition is really just mapping it back to which API definitions that it applies to, right? So it's an array. It can apply to multiple APIs. The next thing is gateways and hosts. So the idea here is that it's bound, like pretty much everything else, the virtual services, to gateways and hosts, right? So that we know where the processing needs to be.
I gotta say, it's a little confusing that this is a gateway resource and it points to gateway resource that's different. Just saying.
API gateways.
Oh, API, yes. Yep. Noted.
Okay, so this needs to be a fully qualified reference or a locally resolved reference, right? So there needs to be a namespace-based naming scheme here.
Yes. This is basically exactly what you would do with a virtual service, right?
So on
Just name or foo/name. Namespace/name.
slash.
I thought it was slash that we're using. Right?
We are using
dotted, right?
It's a dot. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Dot local, whatever.
Oh yeah. Some other doc I just read 2 days ago we're using slash. Okay, I need to go.
Interesting.
So the mixer rules use dot, right? So it's like if you use the full qualified name. So we can use slash, which might be more consistent, right?
Where was it? Oh, this was in the updated authentication policy docs. Oh, that's okay. That's right. The context was, how do you address a global thing, a global rule? Right. So you can, since we have, so it's actually not directly related to this. Yeah, we have this global namespace and a two-level hierarchy. If you're trying to, from the lower level stuff, reference one of these things in this global namespace, what's the semantics? You could provide the explicit name of that global namespace. Slash, and that they were using a slash there, name, or $/name, or just /name, or all these different things, but it was definitely slash.
So the way MCP works is if you have a directory like model, right? So you have the namespaces / the final name, right? So if you need to reference something global, right, you actually just use the name, which directly implies that it is global, right? So
as opposed to implying that it's local.
Yes. So, I mean, in the MCP world, it makes sense, right? So because the collection names are there's no local references in that context.
Yeah. Okay, so
So
we
the
need to
idea here was, yeah, to be consistent with virtual service.
So you can actually use slash as this prefix, right? So if you have slash namespace slash name, that's a fully qualified resolution. If you don't have a slash just name, it's a local resolution. Slash name is a global resolution, right? Which is very consistent with the directory-based semantics.
Okay, so
Style.
yeah.
I mean, is that something that we're moving to for like virtual services?
No, so that's the thing. So
Okay.
so let's go with the virtual service approach. I think the authentication policy thing is what is aberrant at this point. It should consolidate.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Okay. Let's talk about authorization and the classification. So basically, the other part of labeling something as a fully labeled API request. Aside from the API definition itself, we have to understand the context under which that API is valid, and that's where this authorization part comes in. It doesn't work like RBAC authorization in that it's not allow deny. It's a selection process. So what this does is says, and this may be far too simplified, but is for this operation in this API, these attributes are of the request are required for it to match. And I have a basic thing, and I have a note here too that Istio already has multiple request matching systems, and we should probably try to match one of them at least, or match something that's coming. So rather than creating yet another one, which is kind of what I do here. I don't know what that is. I don't know which one we want. I mean, it would be great if we could just use like a rule-based type language. Authorization does not, but policy does. So that's an open question right now.
Yeah, so Sven has a document that's been hanging around for a couple of months there where we want to converge on this. So this needs to participate in that.
Okay. So we can actually target the next meeting to go through those as a list and ratify.
Pick one.
Yeah. I think
I think Sven is coming back next week.
Okay, so we can do that. I mean, in either case, I think this is a more of a tactical choice at the API level rather than a make or break for this particular API. So
yeah,
right. So yeah. So from a general standpoint, we just need some mechanism to determine inclusion on this. So yeah. So ignore what it says, but basically the idea is for this operation, for the get employee operation, I have some rules that say yes, this applies, or no, it does not.
So do you have ways of specifying different HTTP verbs in cases where they've used that in the Open API spec?
It could certainly. Again, depending on the selection process. Like I said, I would prefer we had access to the entire policy type rule thing where you could specify anything out of the request. But yes, I mean.
yeah. So this again, to me, says we want to head towards an attribute-based model with expression language, because that's the only way you can satisfy all the combinations. Everything else is just a kind of a partial attempt to get to that.
yeah.
Right. Now, having said that, generally, so in OpenAPI, it's already specified the verb, the path, and the host, right? So if the verb, path, and host don't match, it's not going to matter. It's not going to get here because yeah, it just doesn't apply.
Yeah, but then you can look at all the other stuff.
Right.
Request
Yes,
headers.
exactly. So outside of those three, yes. And I have a note here. I don't know if I call it out other places. I probably do, but this is basically what we're after here. We want to label a request with the definition, the operation, and the gateway, so that we have full information about that API request.
And that API gateway is the API gateway, not the gateway.
Yes. Again, naming duly noted. Yeah, so
Router?
Hmm?
Router or routing? That be a better name? Router or routing, I mean, sort of gateway.
API router.
well, but it's a lot more than router. I mean, it's policy. Yeah, I mean that's really why. It's because it's policy as well as you're defining three things, right? Again, on the gateway, you're defining the authorization, you're defining the policy, and you're defining the routing. We haven't gotten actually into the policy yet, but let's table that. So also, if the request is not successfully classified, it won't be labeled, but it won't be denied. So at that point, it's up to the other Istio rules, RBAC, etc., to determine what to do with it.
Okay.
Policy. So policy is defined at a very, very high level right now in this, and that is, it is really a list of names of what should be applied, and nothing more. However, that said, so for example, I have like what you would do is put together a mixer rule like you normally would, like some sort of policy, right? And then you would just put that policy in there in your list of policies for that operation. What that does is allows you to basically take advantage of everything that's already there in Istio as far as policy work, and that without having to recreate any of that. The one thing that I wanted to point out in addition to that is that I am leaving it as an object instead of as a string, or as potentially as an object reference instead of just a string. And that would be in order to provide, additional capabilities here, because I imagine that as we evolve it, that we may want to potentially provide overrides or other kinds of information that's coming from this policy spec, or not spec, this policy declaration. So
I'm a little confused with how this works. So what in the mixer rule, you have match colon API.
right.
So what does that mean?
Okay, so here, I skipped that. So here's the thing. The match, I put API, that's irrelevant. Basically, It says false, right?
So don't match anything.
Yeah, we'll match nothing. And so what will happen implementation wise, and I think I don't have it here. I think I just describe it possibly. Let's see. Oh, maybe I don't even say that. Okay, so basically what happens is a rule gets rewritten, right? So it's going to take this, it's going to clone the rule and then put in an appropriate match based on the attributes that we have, right? So we have the API definition operation gateway. We have that information. Basically what it's going to do is rewrite this rule so that it uses the correct information for the operation that we've just specified.
So what does the does the operator write? The operator writes
No.
the, well, the operator writes
Um,
the bottom part?
so they would write this,
Okay.
right, as they would normally do if they wanted to write a rule. But and in fact, match doesn't matter. They can put in a match if they want. It's just that match is going to operate separately, right? So that this is going to be basically a template for the rule that is created by the API system.
I think that's confusing, right? So you're actually creating a rule that's a template that's going to be referenced from the gateway to create the actual.
I mean, it's actually it's the simplest possible way we can do this, and that is all you're doing is writing a rule that is going to be used by the API system.
Okay, but
The only
wouldn't it be simpler to have, if the user writes the section below, or have operations colon, list employees colon, so instead of writing quota colon, the actions are written there. And then from that, you can generate the rule.
Yeah.
As opposed to having this split brain thing.
So
yeah, it's fair.
the other alternative could be, I'm not sure whether we can do this in Mixer, but in the match clause, you can say if this is matching this API operation, that will be the other way to kind of logically think about this.
Also, if all of the API decoding just results in the three attributes, API definition, API gateway, and API something operation, then the match clauses can all be ends up being expressed against these attributes.
Right. So what I'm saying is you can actually write an actual rule with an actual match clause. It's just maybe a bit awkward to write, but that is more consistent.
Correct, but I think Scott is just trying to avoid the user having to use those attributes.
Okay. So, I mean, it makes sense to actually attach it in line to saying policies, quota, and then, or you can say policies and a bunch of like actions. And so handles and actions, instances.
Because then I can understand. Then we have this ownership thing. So the user has written this, the API gateway resource. You produce mixer rules, but these mixer rules are not for use by the user, by the operator, right?
Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention is a thought. So one thought I had that's not in here is that potentially there could be some mechanism to provide additional match somewhere. I guess that would just be here as well then.
So
we could have
further specialize the.
yeah. I mean, so we could literally have for policies basically the match and actions, where match is optional, but could provide additional match. But
I like that composition overall. I think that would work well.
Okay. Yeah, I just what I was trying to avoid was creating duplication of even configuration options, right? So if things changed in how policy rules work, that we wouldn't be changing it here. We're just referencing the name. But I understand. I understand what you're saying there.
Even name it as rules to be consistent, right? Sort of policies, so that you can actually have the same.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
Okay, so effectively what we're saying is it's just like a mixer rule.
Yeah.
But the match parameters are expressed in terms of these API concepts as opposed to just plain attributes. That basically it. Right?
Well, basically they don't have to specify the match parameters.
But it's yeah. It's
I mean, they're
implied.
implicit.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's implicitly specified instead of explicit match condition.
Right. Yes. But yeah, that was the idea, is that it maps directly to policy.
Yeah.
Exactly as we have today.
Interesting.
And that's instead of trying to, create any kind of new policy language or anything like that. Okay, that makes sense to me. And this is just kind of an example of how you might apply global stuff, just using YAML concepts. And then the final thing is routing itself. And basically this takes its cues again from virtual service and allows you to specify for an operation, a host and path for your destination. Nothing too interesting there.
Well, so how would you describe the relationship between this and the virtual service if you're presenting both concepts to somebody?
Yeah, that is the challenge. Is that virtual services are similar, but just not expressive enough. There's a couple of problems. One is I can't route from a virtual service to a virtual service, and we've talked about that before.
Yeah.
Another problem is virtual services don't have any rules, so I can't base it on authentication, right? I can't base it on any information about like the API. So virtual services could provide this capability if they were given that dynamic ability. And I've had other papers that I've kind of noodled around on that idea, but I've not come to anything that feels right around it. So I don't have anything to present on that. But it's certainly something that if we feel like we could address that in virtual services somehow, yeah, that'd be fine. The problem comes is that we have kind of there's a pipeline that we have to go through, and we have to do authentication, or I'm sorry, first we have to do authentication, and then we have to do this classification, and then we get to then we can do the authorization and policy stuff. And the way virtual services work is it's the routing table. And so what I have to do here is actually, once I do the classification, then I can reset what the virtual service is that it's heading towards, and that's what this does. But it's a very static concept in Envoy's routing, and to like completely change it so virtual service is fully dynamic, it's definitely non-trivial.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we want to leave that as an action item that we need to go back, and see if there's still a potential to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to sit down with Louis and kind of brainstorm on this. If there's a way to consolidate a little bit at the front. Okay.
So I guess my big question is, do we expect people to migrate from the old to the new, if you will? All right, we sort of broke it apart with this last discussion, with the policy. Does it become sort of an either or thing, and we have to, sort of back? You can do it this way or this way.
You mean the regular standard policy rules that Mixer uses?
Correct.
I think they need to coexist, right?
Yeah. All existing rules would still work as they normally do. This would just be an additional, they would add rules.
Yeah, so this ends up being a new way to define a rule, but it's complementary.
Okay. Then I sort of go back to the prior discussion on if we, because we're talking about putting the rule, basically replace, where's my notes here? So, we talked about, replacing quota with what was in the rule.
Yeah.
If we, so then I guess it becomes, well, if I already have some rules, does it make sense to continue to use those in the new method?
Well, the rules that we have are triggered based on expressions that evaluate against a set of attributes. Now we're basically have a different way, or we have a generic syntax that produces some of these attributes. You can still write rules that match against those attributes directly. But it seems a little redundant that says, hey, I'm going to produce all these attributes, and then separately I'm going to check that it matches these attributes and implement these rules. All that we're doing here is combining both together, saying, look, I've defined a condition, let me just put the rule there directly, and let the infrastructure figure out how to do the matching and that kind of stuff automatically.
Right. And my only concern was if we already had, if we're using, the existing and we already have rules, would it be better just to call out the rules a la what's in this document versus adding the rule into the policy? But we digress, I think. I think the idea, you answered the idea in that they will continue to coexist and you can use one or the other or both.
Yeah. Right. I mean, theoretically, if you wish to, instead of putting the rules in that gateway spec, you could write them all out per issue. You could use those attributes. Yes.
I think at the end it boils down to elevating the level of abstraction.
Yeah.
So we have the lower level primitives now that you can look at the attributes directly, and now we're saying, well, for many cases you don't need to go that low. You can just your rules can be based entirely on your API descriptions.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so there's a couple open items, but overall I think the model seems is very simple. In the scheme of things, I think it's a nice package there.
It's taken a while to get there, but yes.
Yeah.
I think there's a bunch of tactical items. The only thing that's not tactical feedback-wise is I think getting together with Louis to discuss about how to align with virtual service.
Yeah, or if. Yeah.
If, I assume that can be done offline.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys are going to be, can you follow up on that one, or do you need help following up?
Well, how about I'll just schedule a meeting with Scott and Louis, and we'll just discuss it. And there might be nothing there.
Okay.
And we'll go from there.
That sounds good.
Okay. Right, folks.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
See you later.
See ya.